Broken chains bind. Taken prisoner by Sir Rhys Montrose, the enemy of her house, Lady Juliana of Thornwick expected cruelty. Instead, he studied her with unsettling curiosity. "You are worth more as a hostage than a corpse," he murmured. "But tell me, my lady, if given the choice, would you stay?" Chapter 1. The Lion's Denver. The heavy oak door, reinforced with iron bands that gleamed dully in the torchlight, slammed shut behind Lady Juliana of Thornwick, the sound echoing through the cold, stone chamber like a death knell. She flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and undeniably menacing, the lingering ghost of violence. She was in the heart of Blackwood Castle, the stronghold of Sir Rhys Montrose, the man her brother called the Black Lion, and a name whispered with fear and loathing throughout the borderlands. Juliana, her hands still bound roughly with coarse rope, turned slowly, her gaze sweeping the chamber. It was larger than she expected, not a dank, rat-infested dungeon, but a room clearly used for something. A large, scarred table dominated the center, surrounded by several sturdy stools. One wall was lined with shelves holding various objects she couldn't quite make out in the dim light, scrolls, perhaps, or tools. A single, high window, barred and narrow, offered a sliver of the fading twilight, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. She had been captured only hours before, during a skirmish near the disputed borderlands between Thornwick and Blackwood. The clash had been swift and brutal, her small escort of guardsmen overwhelmed by Montrose's seasoned warriors. She had seen the Black Lion himself, a towering figure in black armor, his face obscured by a visored helmet, his movements swift and deadly. She had seen him cut down 2 of her men before her own horse had been brought down, sending her tumbling to the muddy ground. And then darkness. She had awakened to find herself bound and gagged, slung over the back of a horse like a sack of grain, the rhythmic jostling a constant reminder of her utter helplessness. Now she was here, a prisoner, a pawn in the endless, bitter feud between Thornwick and Blackwood, a feud that had claimed the lives of her father and her eldest brother, leaving her younger brother, Edward, as the new, inexperienced Lord of Thornwick. A wave of despair washed over her, threatening to drown her in its icy grip. She was alone, surrounded by enemies, her fate entirely in the hands of a man renowned for his ruthlessness. What would he do with her? Ransom her? Kill her? The thought sent a fresh shiver of fear down her spine. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching broke through her spiraling thoughts. The door creaked open, and he entered. Sir Rhys Montrose. Even without the imposing black armor, he was a formidable presence. He was taller than she remembered, his broad shoulders straining against the fabric of his dark tunic. His hair, the color of raven's wings, was pulled back from a face that was both harsh and strikingly handsome. Strong, clean-shaven jaw, high cheekbones, and a straight, aristocratic nose. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of polished steel, cold and piercing, yet there was something else there, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity? Assessment? He moved with a grace that belied his size, stopping a few feet from her, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the torches and the frantic beat of her own heart. He removed his leather gloves, slowly, deliberately, and tossed them onto the table. The sound seemed deafening in the stillness. "Lady Juliana," he finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the chamber. "Welcome to Blackwood." The words were polite, almost courteous, but the underlying tone was anything but. It was the voice of a predator, confident in his power, in his control. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show any sign of the fear that gnawed at her insides. "I am no guest here, Sir Rhys. I am your prisoner." A ghost of a smile played at the corners of his lips. "Indeed. A valuable one, at that." He circled her slowly, like a wolf inspecting its prey. She could feel his gaze on her, assessing her, weighing her worth. It was unnerving, unsettling, and yet strangely, not entirely threatening. "You are worth more as a hostage than a corpse," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He stopped in front of her, his proximity sending a shiver of awareness through her, a strange mix of fear and something else. Something she wouldn't name. "Your brother, the young Lord Edward, will be most eager to secure your safe return. He will pay a hefty price, I imagine." Juliana swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "My brother will do what is necessary to protect his people and his lands. But he will not be bullied, Sir Rhys. He will not yield to your demands." His steel-gray eyes narrowed slightly. "Brave words, my lady. But bravery is often foolishness in disguise. Your brother is young, inexperienced. He will learn, as all men do, that sometimes surrender is the only option." He reached out, and for a moment, she thought he was going to strike her. She braced herself, her muscles tensing, but his hand stopped just short of her face. He traced the line of her jaw with a calloused fingertip, the touch surprisingly gentle, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. "You are different than I expected," he said, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "The women of Thornwick are known for their spirit, their fire. But there is a sadness in your eyes, Lady Juliana. A weariness." She flinched at his words, at his uncanny ability to see past the mask of defiance she wore. He was right, of course. The years of conflict, the constant fear, the loss of her loved ones, it had all taken its toll. She was weary, bone-deep weary, of the fighting, the hatred, the endless cycle of violence. "War leaves its mark on everyone, Sir Rhys," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Even on those who survive." He withdrew his hand, his gaze still fixed on hers, that strange, unsettling curiosity still burning in his eyes. "Indeed, it does." He turned away from her, moving towards the table, his back to her. For a moment, she considered trying to escape, to make a run for the door, but she knew it was futile. She was surrounded by his men, in the heart of his stronghold. There was nowhere to go. He picked up a small, silver dagger from the table, turning it over in his hands, the firelight glinting off its polished blade. "You have spirit, Lady Juliana. I admire that. But spirit alone will not save you." He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Tell me," he said, his voice low and intense, "if given the choice, truly given the choice, would you stay?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Stay? Here? In Blackwood? With him? The thought was absurd, unthinkable, and yet, a part of her, a small, buried part of her, felt a flicker of something. Something that defied logic, defied reason, defied everything she knew to be true. Her breath caught, a silent gasp trapped within the suffocating weight of her captivity and the unsettling gaze of the Black Lion. Chapter 2. Echoes of Thornwick. The question echoed in the silence of the chamber, a strange counterpoint to the crackling torches and the ever-present scent of stone, and something indefinably his. Juliana stared at Sir Rhys, her mind reeling. Stay? The word was a betrayal in itself, a whisper of treason against her family, her home, everything she held dear. Yet his gaze held her captive, more effectively than any chains. There was an intensity in those steel-gray eyes, a probing curiosity that unnerved her, yet simultaneously drew her in. She forced herself to find her voice, though it trembled slightly. Stay? As your prisoner? As a bargaining chip in your endless feud with my brother? Rhys tilted his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, but one that spoke volumes. He was studying her, dissecting her every word, every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. He seemed to be looking for something beyond her defiance, beyond the expected response of a captive noblewoman. Not as a prisoner, Lady Juliana, he corrected, his voice low and smooth, like the rustle of silk over steel. Consider it an extended visit, an opportunity to understand your enemy. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh, a hysterical, choked sound that died in her throat. Understand her enemy? The man who had ordered the raid that had resulted in her capture, the man who had killed her kinsman? It was madness. And what makes you think I would want to understand you, Sir Reese? She challenged, lifting her chin, trying to summon the familiar pride of the Thornwick lineage. You are a ruthless warlord, a man who thrives on conflict and bloodshed. He didn't flinch at her words, didn't even seem offended. Instead, that ghost of a smile returned, a flicker of amusement in the depths of his eyes. Ruthless, perhaps, but not without reason. Every action, Lady Juliana, has a purpose. Even war. He moved closer, the distance between them shrinking, intensifying the strange, unsettling energy that seemed to crackle in the air between them. She could smell the faint scent of leather and wood smoke clinging to him, a surprisingly comforting aroma in this cold, forbidding place. Thornwick and Blackwood have been at war for generations, he continued, his voice a low murmur that seemed to wrap around her. A senseless feud, fueled by pride and ancient grievances. But what if there was another way? What if we could find a path to peace? Peace. The word was a balm to her weary soul, a dream she had almost given up on. But could she trust him? Could she trust any Montrose? The history of their families was written in blood, in betrayal, in endless cycles of revenge. Peace is a noble aspiration, Sir Reese, she said, her voice carefully neutral, masking the turmoil of emotions within her. But words are cheap. Actions speak louder. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. Indeed. And my actions, for the moment, are to offer you hospitality. To show you that Blackwood is not the den of monsters your brother believes it to be. He gestured towards a table where a flagon of wine and 2 goblets had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. A servant, silent and unseen, must have placed them there. Will you join me, Lady Juliana? A drink, perhaps, to ease the tension? She hesitated. To accept his offer would be to acknowledge him as something other than her captor, to step onto a dangerous path, a path that could lead to she didn't know where. But to refuse would be to show fear, to confirm his suspicions that she was nothing more than a frightened, helpless woman. And Juliana of Thornwick was not helpless. She might be a prisoner, but she would not be broken. She would use this opportunity, however strange and unsettling, to her advantage. She would learn what she could about him, about Blackwood, about the true nature of this conflict. And then, she would find a way to escape, to return to Thornwick, to her brother, to her people. Very well, Sir Reese, she said, her voice steady now, her gaze meeting his with a newfound determination. I will accept your hospitality. He inclined his head in a gesture of acknowledgement, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his eyes. He poured wine into the goblets, a deep, ruby-red liquid that shimmered in the torchlight. He offered one to her, and she took it, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt of awareness through her, a strange, unexpected warmth that spread through her veins. She took a sip of the wine, savoring the rich, fruity flavor, the warmth that spread through her chilled body. It was surprisingly good, a testament to the wealth and resources of Blackwood. She watched him over the rim of her goblet, studying his face, trying to decipher the enigma that was Sir Reese Montrose. He, in turn, watched her, his gaze intense and unwavering. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the crackling of the torches and the unspoken questions that hung in the air. She lowered her goblet, placing it carefully on the table. Tell me, Sir Reese, she said, her voice soft but firm. What is it you truly want? His eyes held hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of vulnerability, a glimpse of something hidden deep beneath the surface of the hardened warrior. But then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of control. I want what all men want, Lady Juliana, he said, his voice a low rumble. Power. Security. Peace on my own terms. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on her face, her bound hands. And sometimes, he added, his voice barely a whisper, I want the unexpected. His words, and the look that passed between them, left a breathless silence in the room, the echo of her question unanswered, replaced by a growing, unsettling possibility. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in shadows. The unexpected. The word hung between them, a shimmering, dangerous possibility in the dimly lit chamber. Juliana's heart beat faster, a mixture of apprehension and a strange, undeniable curiosity. What did he mean? Was it a threat? A promise? Or something else entirely? She forced herself to maintain a calm exterior, to meet his gaze without flinching, though her insides churned with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt perilously close to fascination. Unexpected, Cerise? She repeated, her voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the turmoil within. I am a prisoner, a pawn in your game. What could possibly be unexpected about that? He took a step closer, his presence filling the small space, making it difficult to breathe. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint scent of leather and steel that clung to him. It was a surprisingly intimate sensation, and it sent a shiver of awareness through her. You are not like the other women I have known, Lady Juliana, he said, his voice low and intimate, his gaze sweeping over her face, lingering on her lips. You possess a strength, a resilience of fire that I find intriguing. Intriguing. The word was a double-edged sword, both flattering and unsettling. She was not accustomed to being the object of such intense scrutiny, especially from a man like him. A man who was both her captor and, seemingly, something more. I am a daughter of Thornwick, Sir Rhys, she said, her voice firm, reminding herself of her lineage, her duty, her purpose. We are not easily intimidated. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, one that reached his eyes and transformed his face from harsh to almost gentle. I can see that. And it is that very spirit that makes you valuable, not just as a hostage, but as something more. He reached out and, before she could react, he took the silver dagger he had been toying with earlier and, with a swift, precise movement, cut the ropes that bound her wrists. She gasped, more from surprise than pain, and rubbed her chafed skin, staring at him in disbelief. He had freed her at least, partially. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He sheathed the dagger, his gaze never leaving hers. Consider it a gesture of good faith. A demonstration that I am not a monster, as your brother believes. Good faith? She echoed, a flicker of skepticism in her voice. You hold me captive in your castle, and you call that good faith? You are free to move within these walls, Lady Juliana, he said, ignoring her sarcasm. You will be treated with respect, given comfortable quarters, provided with everything you need. In return, I ask only for your cooperation. Cooperation. Another ambiguous word, loaded with unspoken implications. What did he expect from her? Information? Allegiance? Her very soul? And what form would this cooperation take? She asked, her voice cautious, wary. He moved towards the window, gazing out at the darkening sky, his back to her. I want you to see Blackwood as it truly is, Lady Juliana. Not through the eyes of your brother, not through the lens of ancient hatreds, but with your own eyes. I want you to understand my people, my goals, my vision. He turned back to her, his expression serious, his gaze intense. I believe that this endless feud between our families is a tragedy, a waste of lives and resources. I believe that there is a better way, a way to forge a lasting peace. But I cannot do it alone. I need an ally. Someone who understands both sides, someone who is willing to bridge the gap. He paused, his gaze searching hers, as if looking for something, some sign of understanding, of agreement. I believe that you, Lady Juliana, could be that ally. The proposition was audacious, almost unbelievable. He wanted her, his prisoner, his enemy, to be his ally? To help him forge peace between their warring families? It was madness. And yet there was a sincerity in his voice, a conviction in his eyes, that made her pause. Could she trust him? Could she even consider such a thing? The risks were enormous. Betrayal, imprisonment, even death were all possibilities. But the potential rewards a lasting peace, an end to the bloodshed, a future for her people those were worth fighting for. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the decision she knew she had to make. She would play his game for now. She would pretend to cooperate, to listen, to learn. She would use this opportunity to gather information, to assess his strengths and weaknesses, to find a way to turn this situation to her advantage. And then, when the time was right, she would strike. "Very well, Sir Reese," she said, her voice calm and steady, masking the calculated deception behind her words. "I will consider your proposal. I will listen to what you have to say. I will observe your people, your castle, your vision." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, his eyes never leaving hers. "That is all I ask, Lady Juliana. For now." He turned and gestured towards the door.
"Come."
"I will show you to your chambers. You must be weary after your journey." The unspoken offer hovered, an unseen weight on the edge of decision, while a spark kindled and flared in her soul. She stepped forward, out of the shadows, ready to see what awaited her. Chapter 4. The Falcon and the Dove. The corridors of Blackwood Castle were a labyrinth of cold stone, dimly lit by flickering torches that cast long, dancing shadows. Juliana followed Sir Reese, her footsteps echoing softly on the flagstones, her senses on high alert. She was acutely aware of her surroundings, of the heavy silence, of the presence of unseen guards, of the sheer weight of the castle itself, a fortress built for war, for defense, for intimidation. She had been given no further restraints, her hands remained free, but she knew she was far from free. Every corridor, every doorway, every shadowed alcove represented a potential threat. She was a dove in a falcon's nest, surrounded by predators, and she had to be constantly vigilant, constantly aware of her surroundings. Reese walked ahead of her, his broad shoulders almost filling the narrow passageway. He moved with a quiet confidence, a natural grace that belied his size and power. He didn't speak, didn't look back, but she could feel his awareness of her, a subtle tension in his posture, a slight turn of his head that indicated he was listening for any sign of what? Escape? Resistance? She had to admit, albeit grudgingly, that he had kept his word so far. She had been treated with a degree of respect that was surprising, given her status as a prisoner. The servant who had brought the wine had been silent but courteous, and the chambers Reese was leading her to, she suspected, would be far from the dank, rat-infested cell she had initially feared. They passed several doorways, some open, revealing glimpses of other rooms, a guardroom, a library, a small chapel with a single, flickering candle illuminating a statue of the Virgin Mary. The sight of the chapel gave her a momentary pang of longing, a reminder of the familiar comforts of her faith, of the quiet sanctuary she had found in the chapel at Thornwick. Finally, they reached a heavy, oak door at the end of a long corridor. Reese stopped and turned to her, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "These will be your chambers, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice low and resonant. "They are comfortable, I believe, and relatively secure." The last word was spoken with a hint of irony, a subtle reminder that she was still his prisoner, despite the outward appearance of courtesy. He pushed open the door, revealing a surprisingly spacious room. It was circular, clearly located within one of the castle's towers, and much larger than the chamber where she had first been brought. A large, four-poster bed dominated one side of the room, draped with heavy velvet curtains in a deep shade of burgundy. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow over the room, chasing away the chill of the stone walls. A table and 2 chairs stood near the window, and a large chest sat at the foot of the bed. It was surprisingly luxurious, far more so than she had expected, and that, in itself, was unsettling. "There is a dressing room through that door," Reese said, pointing to a smaller door on the opposite side of the room. "And a privy. I have instructed my servants to provide you with everything you need. Clothes, toiletries, whatever you require." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her travel-stained dress, her disheveled hair, her weary expression. "You will find that Blackwood is not without its comforts, Lady Juliana. Despite its reputation." She met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated by his words, by his presence. Comforts are meaningless without freedom, Sir Reese. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her point. Freedom is a relative term, Lady Juliana. We are all prisoners of something. Duty, obligation, circumstance, even our own desires. He moved towards the door, his hand resting on the heavy iron latch. I will leave you to rest. Dinner will be served in the Great Hall in 2 hours. I expect you to join me. It was not an invitation, but a command, delivered with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. And if I refuse? She challenged, a flicker of defiance in her voice. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. You will not, he said simply. You are too curious, Lady Juliana. Too intelligent to remain hidden away in your chambers. You want to know what I am planning, what my intentions are. And the only way to find out is to play the game. He opened the door, the sudden influx of cool air from the corridor causing the flames in the hearth to dance wildly. Until dinner, then Lady Juliana. He stepped out, closing the door behind him with a soft click that echoed through the room. She was alone. She stood for a moment, listening to his retreating footsteps, her mind racing. He was right, of course. She was curious. She did want to know what he was planning. And she would play his game, but on her own terms. She moved towards a window, gazing out at the darkening landscape. Below her, the courtyard was bustling with activity, men at arms moving to and fro, servants carrying torches, the sounds of their voices and laughter drifting up to her. Beyond the castle walls, the forest stretched out like a dark, impenetrable sea, the trees silhouetted against the fading light. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was also a Thornwick, and she would not be broken. She would use this opportunity, this strange captivity, to her advantage. She would learn everything she could about Blackwood, about Reese Montrose, about his plans. And then she would find a way to escape, to return to her brother, to her people, to her home. A flicker of hope, a stubborn resolve, began to burn brightly in her heart, a small flame against the encroaching darkness. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer for guidance, for strength to play this new part. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Stone. The hours before dinner passed slowly. Juliana explored her chambers, her initial apprehension gradually giving way to a grudging appreciation for their unexpected comfort. The dressing room was stocked with a variety of gowns, far more elaborate than anything she owned at Thornwick. Silks, velvets, and brocades in rich jewel tones, adorned with intricate embroidery and delicate lace. It was a clear display of Blackwood's wealth and power, a subtle reminder of her captive status. She chose a gown of deep emerald green, a color that complemented her auburn hair and fair skin. It was simpler than the others, but still elegant, with long, flowing sleeves and a fitted bodice. As she dressed, she examined herself in the small, silvered mirror that hung on the wall. She looked different. The gown, the surroundings, the sheer strangeness of her situation had all combined to create a sense of unreality, as if she were playing a role in some elaborate play. A servant, a young woman with downcast eyes and a quiet demeanor, arrived to help her with her hair, braiding it into a complex style that was both elegant and practical. The servant didn't speak, didn't meet her gaze, and Juliana wondered if she had been instructed to remain silent, to avoid any unnecessary interaction with the prisoner. She found a small, wooden box on the dressing table, containing a few simple pieces of jewelry, a silver necklace with a single emerald pendant, a pair of matching earrings, a delicate bracelet. She put them on, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of her skin. They were beautiful, undeniably so, but they felt foreign, like a disguise. With nothing else to occupy her, she paced the circular room, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She examined the tapestries that hung on the walls, depicting scenes of hunting and hawking, of knights in shining armor battling dragons and mythical beasts. They were beautifully crafted, but they spoke of a world of violence and conquest, a world that was both familiar and alien to her. She paused by the window, gazing out at the darkening landscape. The courtyard below was now quieter, the activity having subsided as the hour of dinner approached. She could see the lights of the great hall, hear the faint strains of music drifting up to her, the sounds of laughter and conversation. She was about to enter that world, the world of her captor, of her enemy. She would have to be careful, watchful, to play her role convincingly. She would have to be the dove, masking the falcon within. A knock on the door startled her. She turned, her heart beating faster. "Enter," she said, her voice steady, masking the apprehension she felt. The door opened, and a young man entered, bowing low. He was dressed in the livery of Blackwood, a black lion embroidered on his tunic. He was tall and slender, with dark hair and intense, intelligent eyes. "My lady," he said, his voice polite but formal. "Sir Reese has sent me to escort you to the great hall." She nodded, gathering her composure. "Very well. Lead the way." She followed him out of the room and down the corridor, her senses on high alert. She was aware of every detail, of the flickering torchlight, of the echoes of their footsteps, of the heavy silence that seemed to press down on her. They descended a winding staircase, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. She could hear the sounds of the great hall growing louder as they approached, the buzz of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the strains of music. They reached the bottom of the staircase and entered a large, vaulted hallway. At the far end, she could see the entrance to the great hall, a pair of massive oak doors, thrown open to reveal the brightly lit interior. As they approached the doors, she could see the assembled guests, a sea of faces, all turned towards her. She felt a wave of apprehension, a sense of being on display, of being judged. She was the outsider, the enemy, the captive. The young man stopped just outside the doors and turned to her, bowing again. "My lady," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "May I offer a word of advice?" She looked at him, surprised. He was the first person in Blackwood, other than Reese himself, who had spoken to her with anything other than formal courtesy. "Advice?" she repeated, her voice questioning. He glanced around, as if to make sure they were not overheard. "Sir Reese is a complex man, my lady. He is not always what he seems. Be careful what you say, what you do. Trust no one completely." He straightened up, his expression once again formal, impassive. "And now, my lady, if you will follow me." He pushed open the doors, and she stepped into the great hall. The noise and the light washed over her, a wave of sound and color. She was immediately the center of attention, every eye in the room fixed on her. She could feel their curiosity, their suspicion, their hostility. At the far end of the hall, seated at the high table, she saw him. Sir Reese Montrose. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. He rose to his feet as she approached, a gesture of respect or mockery. She didn't know, but she would not be intimidated. She would play her role, and she would survive. She walked to him, her head held high, every movement and word to come planned, guarded, a step into the lion's den with a purpose. She kept silent, locked inside. Chapter 6. The Price of Defiance. The Great Hall of Blackwood was a spectacle of medieval grandeur. High, vaulted ceilings soared above, supported by massive stone pillars. Tapestries depicting scenes of battle and triumph adorned the walls, their colors vibrant in the light of hundreds of candles. Long tables, laden with food and drink, stretched the length of the hall, filled with the lords and ladies of Blackwood, their retainers and their guests. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, spices, and wine, mingled with the underlying aroma of wood smoke and humanity. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of conversation, laughter, and music. Juliana felt a wave of disorientation, a sense of being overwhelmed by the sheer scale and intensity of it all. As she approached the high table, she was acutely aware of the eyes upon her, assessing, judging, questioning. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken hostility, the barely concealed curiosity. She was the enemy, the captive, the outsider. And yet, she had to maintain her composure, to project an image of strength and defiance, to show no sign of weakness. Reese Montrose, seated at the center of the high table, rose to greet her, a gesture that was both courteous and possessive. He was dressed in a dark velvet doublet, embroidered with silver thread, a stark contrast to the plain tunic he had worn earlier. He looked every inch the Lord of Blackwood, powerful, commanding, and undeniably attractive. "Lady Juliana," he said, his voice booming across the hall, silencing the surrounding conversations. "Welcome to Blackwood. I trust you found your accommodations satisfactory?" The question was loaded with unspoken implications, a subtle reminder of her captive status, of his control over her. She met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "They are adequate, Sir Rhys," she replied, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the hall. "Though I prefer the freedom of my own home." A ripple of murmurs spread through the assembled guests. Her defiance was unexpected, a challenge to his authority in front of his own people. She could see a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly masked by a carefully neutral expression. "Freedom is a luxury few can afford, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice smooth, but with an underlying edge of steel. "Especially in times of war." He gestured to the seat beside him, a heavy, carved chair that was clearly intended for a person of high rank. "Please be seated. Join us." She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. To refuse would be another act of defiance, but it would also be foolish. She needed to observe, to learn, to gather information. And the best way to do that was to play along, to pretend to be the cooperative guest. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of reluctant acceptance. "Thank you, Sir Rhys." She took the seat beside him, acutely aware of his proximity, of the heat radiating from his body, of the faint scent of leather and spices that clung to him. It was a surprisingly intimate sensation, and it sent a shiver of awareness through her, a mixture of apprehension and something else. Something she wouldn't define. The meal began, a seemingly endless procession of dishes: roasted boar, venison, pheasant, salmon, all served with elaborate sauces and side dishes. Wine flowed freely, and the conversation around the table gradually resumed, though Juliana noticed that many eyes still lingered on her, assessing, judging. Rhys, to his credit, made an effort to include her in the conversation, asking her questions about Thornwick, about her family, about her life. His questions were polite, even interested, but she knew he was probing, searching for weaknesses, for information he could use. She answered his questions carefully, revealing little, deflecting his probes with subtle evasions and ambiguous answers. She was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between defiance and cooperation, and she knew that one wrong step could have dire consequences. Across the table, she noticed a woman watching her with particular intensity. She was older, perhaps in her late 40s, with sharp features and a severe expression. She was dressed in a gown of dark gray, adorned with silver jewelry, and she had an air of authority about her. Juliana met her gaze, and the woman gave a slight nod, a flicker of something in her eyes. "Recognition? Warning? That is my aunt, Lady Eleanor," Rhys said, following Juliana's gaze. "She is a valuable advisor, and a formidable woman." The understatement was clear. Lady Eleanor looked like someone who could command armies, someone who would not hesitate to crush anyone who stood in her way. The meal continued, and Juliana found herself increasingly drawn into the conversation, despite her initial apprehension. She learned about the history of Blackwood, about its traditions, its customs, its people. She listened to their stories, their concerns, their hopes. And she began to see them, not just as enemies, but as individuals, as human beings with their own fears and aspirations. It was a subtle shift, a gradual erosion of the rigid boundaries she had erected in her mind, and it was unsettling. As the evening drew to a close, Rhys rose to his feet, signaling the end of the meal. "Lady Juliana," he said, his voice carrying across the hall, "I hope you have enjoyed your introduction to Blackwood." She rose as well, meeting his gaze, her expression carefully neutral. "It has been enlightening, Sir Rhys." He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I am glad to hear it, because there is much more to come." There was a finality in the tone, and the weight of his words settled in her stomach. She was here, committed to a course that felt more dangerous by the moment. Chapter 7. A Glimmer of Grace. The days that followed settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Juliana was a prisoner, yet she was treated with a degree of courtesy that bordered on respect. She was free to move within the castle walls, to explore the library, the gardens, even the stables, though she was always accompanied by a silent, watchful guard, a constant reminder of her captive status. She ate her meals in the great hall, seated beside Rhys, subjected to the scrutiny of the Blackwood court. She learned to navigate the complex web of relationships, the alliances and rivalries, the unspoken tensions that simmered beneath the surface of polite conversation. She observed Rhys, studying his interactions with his people, his advisors, his enemies. She saw the ruthless warlord, the man who commanded armies and dispensed justice with a firm hand. But she also saw glimpses of something else, a weariness, a sense of burden, a hint of vulnerability that he carefully concealed from the world. She continued to play her role, the cooperative guest, the curious observer. She asked questions, listened to answers, gathered information. She was like a sponge, soaking up everything she could about Blackwood, about its strengths and weaknesses, about its people and its politics. She spent hours in the library, poring over ancient texts, historical chronicles, maps of the borderlands. She learned about the long, bloody history of the feud between Thornwick and Blackwood, the countless battles, the betrayals, the endless cycle of revenge. She discovered that the feud had begun centuries ago, over a disputed strip of land, a seemingly insignificant piece of territory that had become a symbol of pride and honor for both families. Generations of Montroses and Thornwicks had fought and died for that land, and the hatred between them had become ingrained, passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. One afternoon, she was walking in the gardens, a walled enclosure filled with herbs, flowers, and fruit trees. It was a surprisingly peaceful place, a refuge from the cold, stone walls of the castle. She was accompanied by her usual guard, a young man named Thomas, who remained silent and unobtrusive, keeping a respectful distance. As she walked, she noticed Lady Eleanor, Rhys's aunt, seated on a stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree. She was reading a book, her expression serene, her posture relaxed. It was the first time Juliana had seen her outside of the great hall, and she seemed different, less formidable, more approachable. Juliana hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach her. But something, a flicker of intuition, a sense of connection, prompted her to take a chance. "Lady Eleanor," she said, her voice soft, hesitant. The older woman looked up, her sharp gray eyes meeting Juliana's. For a moment, she seemed surprised, then her expression softened slightly. "Lady Juliana," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You are enjoying the gardens?" "Yes," Juliana replied. "They are a welcome respite from the castle walls." Lady Eleanor nodded, closing her book and placing it on the bench beside her. Blackwood can be oppressive at times, especially for those who are not accustomed to its ways. The unspoken words hung in the air, a subtle acknowledgement of Juliana's captive status. "I am adapting," Juliana said, her voice carefully neutral. Lady Eleanor studied her for a moment, her gaze intense, probing. "You are stronger than you appear, Lady Juliana, and more perceptive." The words were a compliment, but they were also a warning. Lady Eleanor was not fooled by Juliana's outward demeanor, by her pretense of cooperation. "I am a Thornwick, my lady," Juliana said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting Eleanor's without flinching. "We are not easily broken." A flicker of respect appeared in Lady Eleanor's eyes. "Indeed. And that is why you are here." The words were cryptic, ambiguous, but Juliana sensed that they held a deeper meaning. She was here, not just as a hostage, but for some other purpose, some hidden agenda that she had yet to uncover. "Why am I here, my lady?" Juliana asked, her voice direct, challenging. Lady Eleanor smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile. "That, Lady Juliana," is something you must discover for yourself. And at the moment, that small smile was a far cry from the warmth she sought. But it was the first hint of any sort of conversation outside of Reese. Chapter 8. The Serpent's Kiss. The conversation with Lady Eleanor left Juliana with more questions than answers. The older woman's cryptic words, her knowing glances, her subtle hints of a hidden agenda, it all pointed to a deeper game being played, a game in which Juliana was a pawn, but perhaps a more important pawn than she had initially realized. She continued her exploration of Blackwood, her observations becoming more focused, more purposeful. She sought out the whispers, the rumors, the unspoken tensions that simmered beneath the surface of the courtly life. She listened to the conversations of the servants, the guards, the lesser lords and ladies, piecing together fragments of information, trying to understand the true nature of Reese Montrose's plans. One evening, during dinner in the great hall, she noticed a new face at the high table. A man, tall and slender, with dark, slicked-back hair and a cruel, sensual mouth. He was dressed in richly embroidered clothing, and he wore a jeweled ring on his finger, a serpent coiled around a ruby. He had an air of arrogance about him, a sense of entitlement that set him apart from the other members of the court. Reese introduced him as Lord Valerius, a distant cousin and a valued ally. But Juliana sensed a tension between them, a subtle undercurrent of rivalry, of mistrust. Valerius's eyes lingered on her, assessing, predatory, and she felt a shiver of unease. During the meal, Valerius engaged her in conversation, his voice smooth and charming, but with an underlying edge of mockery. He asked her about Thornwick, about her family, about her captivity. His questions were pointed, intrusive, designed to provoke, to unsettle. "It must be difficult, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "to be so far from home, surrounded by your enemies. To be at the mercy of the Black Lion." She met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated by his insinuations. "I am a Thornwick, Lord Valerius," she said, her voice steady, her tone defiant. "We are accustomed to adversity." He smiled, a slow, cruel smile that revealed his sharp teeth. "Indeed. But even the strongest walls can be breached, Lady Juliana. Even the most resilient spirit can be broken." She felt a chill run down her spine. His words were a threat, veiled but unmistakable. She sensed that he was not just a rival to Reese, but a danger to her, a serpent in the garden. Later that evening, as she was walking back to her chambers, accompanied by her silent guard, she encountered Valerius in the corridor. He was standing in a shadowed alcove, as if waiting for her. "Lady Juliana," he said, his voice low and seductive. "A word with you, if I may." She hesitated, her instincts warning her to avoid him. But she knew that to refuse would be to show fear, to confirm his suspicions that she was vulnerable. "What is it, Lord Valerius?" she asked, her voice cool, detached. He stepped out of the shadows, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I have been observing you, Lady Juliana, and I must say, I am impressed. You possess a rare combination of beauty and defiance. A dangerous combination." She remained silent, her gaze fixed on his, waiting for him to reveal his true intentions. He moved closer, his proximity unsettling, his scent, a cloying mixture of musk and spices, overwhelming. "I believe we could be allies, Lady Juliana. You and I. We both have ambitions, desires, things we want that are out of reach." He reached out and touched her arm, his fingers lingering on her skin, sending a shiver of revulsion through her. "I could help you, Lady Juliana. I could help you escape this gilded cage. I could help you return to Thornwick, to your brother, to your freedom." She pulled her arm away, her eyes flashing with anger. "I do not need your help, Lord Valerius. I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself." He laughed, a low, throaty sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Perhaps. But even the most capable woman needs a protector. Someone to watch over her, to guide her, to satisfy her desires." His meaning was clear, his intentions blatant. He was offering her an alliance, a partnership, but it was an alliance based on lust, on power, on betrayal. I am not interested in your protection, Lord Valerius, she said, her voice cold, her tone final. And I would never betray my family, my people, or myself. She turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had just made a dangerous enemy. She had rejected his advances, his offer of alliance, and she knew that he would not forget it. She reached her chambers, her guard unlocking the door for her. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, leaning against it, her body trembling. She had survived another encounter, another test. But she knew that the game was becoming more dangerous, the stakes higher. She was surrounded by enemies, by those who would use her, betray her, even kill her. And she had to be ready. She had to be stronger, smarter, more ruthless. She had to become the falcon, not the dove. Only then could she break free. Chapter 9. Beneath a Watchful Moon. Sleep eluded Juliana that night. The encounter with Lord Valerius had left her shaken, her mind racing with a mixture of anger, fear, and a growing sense of unease. She tossed and turned in the large four-poster bed, the silken sheets tangling around her legs, the heavy velvet curtains seeming to suffocate her. She rose and went to the window, pushing open the shutters, letting in the cool night air. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the castle and the surrounding landscape. The courtyard below was deserted, the only sound the distant hooting of an owl, the occasional bark of a dog. She gazed out at the scene, her thoughts swirling. She was trapped, surrounded by enemies, caught in a web of intrigue and deceit. She had rejected Valerius's offer, but she knew that he would not give up easily. He was a dangerous man, a predator, and she had to be constantly vigilant, constantly on her guard. But she was not alone. She had Rhys. The thought surprised her. He was her captor, her enemy, the man who had brought her to this place, who held her fate in his hands. And yet, she couldn't deny the strange connection she felt with him, the unsettling attraction, the grudging respect. He had treated her with courtesy, with a degree of respect that was unexpected. He had offered her hospitality, cooperation, even peace. But could she trust him? Could she believe in his sincerity? Or was it all a ruse, a carefully crafted deception designed to lull her into a false sense of security? She didn't know. And that uncertainty was the most terrifying thing of all. A sound behind her made her turn. She had thought she was alone, but standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor, was Rhys. He was dressed in a simple tunic and breeches, his hair unbound, falling around his shoulders. He looked different, younger, less imposing than he did in the great hall, surrounded by his court. I couldn't sleep, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I saw your light. She didn't reply, her gaze fixed on his, her heart beating faster. His presence in her chambers, at this hour, was unexpected, unsettling. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He moved towards her, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Are you well, Lady Juliana? He asked, his voice concerned. You seem troubled. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to confide in him, whether to reveal her fears, her doubts. But something in his eyes, a sincerity, a genuine concern, prompted her to speak. I had a disturbing encounter with Lord Valerius, she said, her voice low, her gaze dropping to the floor. Rhys's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. Valerius? What did he say to you? She told him, recounting the conversation, Valerius's insinuations, his offer of alliance, his veiled threats. As she spoke, she felt a sense of relief, a release of the tension that had been building inside her. When she finished, Rhys was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on her, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. Valerius is a dangerous man, Lady Juliana, he said, his voice low and intense. He is ambitious and scrupulous, and he will stop at nothing to get what he wants. You were right to reject him. He squeezed her hand, his grip firm, reassuring. But you do not have to fear him. I will protect you. The words were unexpected, and they sent a shiver of warmth through her. He was her captor, her enemy, and yet he was offering her protection, promising to keep her safe.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you protect me? He looked at her, his steel-gray eyes searching hers, as if looking for something, some sign of understanding, of trust. Because, he said, his voice soft, almost a murmur, you are more than just a prisoner to me, Lady Juliana. You are something more. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was unexpected, intimate, and it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind reeling. He was her enemy, her captor, and yet she felt drawn to him, attracted to him, in a way that defied logic, defied reason, defied everything she knew to be true. The pull was undeniable, and the reality crashed against her heart, a captive longing for a connection she was forbidden to feel. Chapter 10. Scars of the Past. The kiss, a brief, fleeting touch of his lips against her skin, lingered in the air between them, a silent testament to the unspoken emotions that swirled beneath the surface of their forced proximity. Juliana's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Rhys, her eyes wide, questioning, searching for answers in his enigmatic gaze. He released her hand, stepping back slightly, creating a space between them, a distance that felt both necessary and disappointing. The intensity of the moment, the unexpected intimacy, had left her shaken, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling. I should not have done that, he said, his voice rough, his gaze dropping to the floor. Forgive me, Lady Juliana. It was inappropriate. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. No, she couldn't find the words to express the confusion, the turmoil of emotions that churned within her. She was drawn to him, yes, attracted to him, in a way that defied logic, defied reason, defied everything she knew to be true. But she couldn't forget who he was, what he was. Her captor, her enemy, the man who held her fate in his hands. You asked why I would protect you, he said, his voice regaining its composure, his gaze meeting hers again. It is complicated. There are things you do not know, Lady Juliana. Things about my past, about my motivations. He turned and walked towards the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape, his back to her. She watched him, her curiosity piqued, her apprehension growing. What secrets did he hide? What shadows lurked in his past? I was not always the Black Lion, he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. There was a time before the war, before the hatred, before the bloodshed. A time when I believed in other things. He paused, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if burdened by a heavy weight. She sensed that he was struggling to reveal something painful, something he had kept hidden for a long time. I was betrothed, he continued, his voice barely audible, to a woman from a neighboring family. Her name was Lyra. She was beautiful, kind, gentle. Everything I was not. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a sadness, a longing that pierced her heart. We were to be married. It was an arranged marriage, of course, a political alliance. But we fell in love. We believed that our union could bring peace to our families, an end to the endless cycle of violence. He paused again, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if lost in the memories of the past. But it was not to be. Her family, they betrayed us. They attacked Blackwood, slaughtered my people, and they killed her. The words were spoken with a quiet intensity, a raw emotion that revealed the depth of his pain, the scars that he carried within him. Juliana felt a surge of empathy, a compassion that surprised her. She had seen him as a ruthless warlord, a cold, calculating enemy. But now, she saw him as a man who had loved and lost, a man who had been scarred by tragedy. I am sorry, Sir Rhys, she said, her voice soft, sincere. I did not know. He shook his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. It is not your fault, Lady Juliana. It is the fault of hatred, of greed, of the endless, senseless pursuit of power. He moved towards her, his gaze intense, searching. That is why I brought you here, Lady Juliana. not just as a hostage, but as a hope for something better, a hope for peace. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, the touch surprisingly gentle, sending a shiver of warmth through her. I see in you, Lady Juliana, a strength, a resilience, a compassion that reminds me of her. Of Lyra. The words were a revelation, a key to understanding his motivations, his actions. He saw in her, not just an enemy, but a reflection of the woman he had loved and lost, a symbol of the peace he craved. The weight of that past, of Lyra, and the hopes he projected, felt heavy, unspoken, hanging between them. Chapter 11. The Unveiling of Truth. The revelation of Rhys's past, of his lost love, Lyra, and the tragic circumstances of her death, changed everything. It shattered the image Juliana had carefully constructed of him, the ruthless warlord, the cold, calculating enemy. She saw him now as a man scarred by loss, burdened by guilt, and driven by a desperate desire for peace. The following days were marked by a shift in their relationship, a subtle but significant change in the dynamic between them. The formal courtesy remained, the outward pretense of captor and captive, but beneath the surface, there was a growing understanding, a shared sense of something. Something that was more than just respect, more than just attraction, something that was dangerous. Rhys began to seek her out, not just during meals in the Great Hall, but in the library, the gardens, the stables. He would find her, and they would talk. Not about politics, not about the war, but about everything else. He told her more about his childhood, about his relationship with his father, a stern, demanding man who had trained him from a young age to be a warrior, to lead, to rule. He told her about his dreams, his aspirations, his fears. She, in turn, began to open up to him, sharing her own experiences, her own losses, her own hopes for the future. She told him about her father, a kind, gentle man who had taught her to love books, to appreciate beauty, to believe in the power of kindness. She told him about her brother, Edward, young and inexperienced, struggling to fill their father's shoes, to lead Thornwick through these turbulent times. She found herself confiding in him, sharing her fears, her doubts, her vulnerabilities, in a way she had never done with anyone before. It was a strange, unsettling feeling to be so open, so honest with her enemy. But it was also liberating. One afternoon, they were walking in the gardens, the air filled with the scent of roses and lavender. The sun was shining, casting a warm, golden glow over the scene. It was a beautiful day, a moment of peace in the midst of the storm that raged around them. "I've been thinking," Rhys said, his voice low, thoughtful, "about what you said about finding a way to end this feud. About peace." She looked at him, her heart beating faster. His words were a confirmation of her hopes, a validation of the fragile trust that was growing between them. "And?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped walking, turning to face her, his gaze intense, searching. "I believe it is possible, Lady Juliana. I believe that we together could find a way. But it will not be easy. There are those who oppose peace, those who profit from the war, those who are blinded by hatred." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "Valerius is one of them. He is a dangerous man, Lady Juliana. And he is not alone. There are others in my court, in my own family, who would see us fail." She nodded, her gaze meeting his, her hand clasping his tightly. "I know. I have seen it. The suspicion, the hostility, the whispers. We must be careful, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We must trust no one completely. Except each other." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was offering her, not just an alliance, but a partnership, a bond of trust that transcended their roles as captor and captive, as enemies. "I trust you, Rhys," she said, her voice trembling slightly, the words both a confession and a commitment. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face from harsh to gentle. "And I trust you, Juliana." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that was both tender and intimate. The touch sent a shiver of warmth through her, a feeling of hope, of possibility. A shadow fell across them, and they both turned to see Lady Eleanor standing at the entrance to the garden, her expression unreadable. "Rhys," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. "A word with you."
Now.
The moment was broken, the spell shattered. The reality of their situation, the dangers that surrounded them, came crashing back. He squeezed her hand one last time and went to his aunt, the truth settling between them, raw and dangerous. Chapter 12. A Knight's Burden. Rhys followed his aunt, leaving Juliana standing alone in the garden, the warmth of his touch still lingering on her skin, the echo of his words still ringing in her ears. She watched them go, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She had trusted him, declared her trust, and now she could only wait. Lady Eleanor led Rhys to a small, secluded chamber, a private study filled with books, maps, and ancient scrolls. It was a room she used for confidential matters, for discussions that required absolute privacy. "What is it, Aunt?" Rhys asked, his voice impatient, his mind still on Juliana, on the fragile bond of trust they had forged. Eleanor closed the door behind them, her expression grave, her eyes filled with concern. "It is about the Lady Juliana," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You are becoming too close to her, Rhys. Too involved." He frowned, his jaw tightening. "She is my prisoner, Aunt. I am simply using her. Gathering information, assessing her strengths and weaknesses." Eleanor shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "You are deceiving yourself, Rhys. And that is dangerous. For you, for Blackwood, for everyone." She moved towards him, her voice softening slightly. "I know about Lyra, Rhys. I know about your loss. And I understand your attraction to the Lady Juliana. She reminds you of her, doesn't she? Her spirit, her strength, her beauty." He turned away, his gaze fixed on the window, his back to her. He didn't want to talk about Lyra, about the pain, the guilt, the memories that still haunted him. "It is not the same, Aunt," he said, his voice rough, his tone defensive. "Juliana is different." "Different, yes," Eleanor agreed. "But also dangerous. She is a Thornwick, Rhys. Your enemy. And you are falling in love with her." The words were spoken plainly, bluntly, and they struck him like a blow. He turned back to her, his eyes flashing with anger. "That is not true," he denied, his voice tight, controlled. "I am simply using her. As I said." Eleanor sighed, her expression filled with a mixture of sadness and pity. "You cannot lie to me, Rhys. I have known you since you were a boy. I see the way you look at her, the way you speak to her, the way you protect her. You are walking a dangerous path, my nephew, and it could lead to your destruction." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. "I am not saying you should mistreat her, Rhys. But you must be careful. You must remember who she is, what she represents. You cannot allow your feelings to cloud your judgment." He pulled away from her, his frustration growing. "I am not a fool, Aunt. I know what I am doing." "Do you?" she challenged, her gaze unwavering. "Or are you letting your heart rule your head? Are you risking everything for a woman who may betray you in the end?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken doubts, with the weight of history, of the endless feud between their families. He didn't answer, he couldn't answer. He didn't know the truth himself. He turned and walked towards the door, his mind racing, his emotions in turmoil. He was torn between his duty, his obligations, his desires. He was walking a tightrope, balancing between his head and his heart, between his past and his future. He reached the door, his hand resting on the heavy iron latch. He paused, looking back at his aunt, his expression troubled, uncertain. "I appreciate your concern, Aunt," he said, his voice low, strained. "But I must make my own decisions. I must follow my own instincts." His burden was clear, and it resonated in every word. He knew, as he stepped back out, that the choice would not be easy. Chapter 13. Threads of Deception. Rhys's internal conflict, the struggle between his duty and his growing feelings for Juliana, was palpable. He became more withdrawn, more guarded, his interactions with her marked by a subtle but significant distance. He still sought her out, still engaged her in conversation, but the warmth, the intimacy, the shared sense of trust that had begun to blossom between them seemed to have withered. Juliana sensed the change, felt the shift in his demeanor, and it troubled her deeply. She didn't know what had caused it, what had transpired between him and Lady Eleanor, but she knew that something had broken. The fragile bridge of trust they had built was crumbling. She tried to talk to him, to understand what was happening, but he evaded her questions, deflected her concerns, offering only vague excuses and cryptic explanations. He was shutting her out, closing himself off, and she didn't know why. Meanwhile, the court of Blackwood continued its intricate dance of politics and intrigue. Lord Valerius, his advances rebuffed, his offer of alliance rejected, became more openly hostile, more overtly threatening. He whispered his poison in the ears of the other lords and ladies, spreading rumors, sowing seeds of doubt, undermining Juliana's position, questioning Rhys's judgment. She overheard snippets of conversation, caught veiled glances, sensed the growing suspicion, the hostility, the fear. She was becoming increasingly isolated, surrounded by enemies, with only Rhys as her potential ally. And he was slipping away. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner in the Great Hall, during which Valerius had made several pointed remarks about the dangers of trusting one's enemies, Juliana decided to take matters into her own hands. She had to know what was happening, what had caused Rhys's change of heart, what was threatening the fragile bond they had forged. She waited until the castle was quiet, until the servants had retired, until the only sound was the distant hooting of an owl, the occasional creak of the ancient timbers. Then, she slipped out of her chambers, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She made her way through the darkened corridors, her footsteps silent on the stone floors, her path lit only by the faint glow of the moon through the high, narrow windows. She knew where Rhys's chambers were located, having observed him entering and exiting them on several occasions. She reached his door, hesitating for a moment, her hand raised to knock. She knew that she was taking a risk, that she could be discovered, that she could be accused of spying, of treason. But she had to know the truth. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever might happen, and knocked softly on the door. There was a moment of silence, then a muffled voice from within. "Who is it?" "It is I, Juliana," she said, her voice low, barely a whisper. There was another pause, then the sound of footsteps approaching, and the door opened slowly, revealing Rhys standing in the doorway, his expression surprised, guarded. He was dressed in a simple tunic and breeches, his hair unbound, falling around his shoulders. He looked tired, weary, the lines of strain etched on his face. "Juliana?" he said, his voice questioning, his gaze searching hers. "What is it? What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you, Rhys," she said, her voice urgent, her gaze pleading. "I need to understand what is happening. Why are you pushing me away?" He hesitated for a moment, his gaze dropping to the floor. Then he stepped back, opening the door wider, inviting her in. "Come in," he said, his voice low, resigned. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. She was in his chambers, alone with him, in the darkness, and the air was thick with unspoken tension, with the weight of their unacknowledged feelings. The threads of deception, from others and their own hearts, were tightening. The truth, she felt, was near but dangerous. Chapter 14. The Heart's Reckoning. Rhys's chambers were surprisingly austere, reflecting the man himself, functional, unadorned, yet possessing a certain understated elegance. A large, four-poster bed dominated one side of the room, draped with heavy curtains in a dark, muted color. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. A table and two chairs stood near the window, and a large chest sat at the foot of the bed. There were no tapestries, no paintings, no decorations of any kind, only a few well-worn books stacked on a shelf. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their respective burdens. Juliana stood just inside the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her gaze fixed on Rhys, waiting for him to speak. He moved towards the fire, adding a few logs to the embers, stirring them into a brighter flame. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, struggling to find the words to express what was in his heart, in his mind. "I have been foolish, Juliana," he said finally, his voice low and rough, his back to her. "I have allowed my feelings to cloud my judgment. I have put you and myself in danger." She took a step closer, her voice soft, concerned. "What do you mean? What danger?" He turned to face her, his steel-gray eyes filled with a mixture of sadness, regret, and something else. Something that looked like fear. "My aunt, Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning. "She believes she knows that I am becoming too close to you, that I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air, a stark, undeniable truth that had been lurking beneath the surface of their interactions, their unspoken desires, their forbidden connection. Juliana's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known, she had sensed it, but to hear him say it, to acknowledge it, was overwhelming. "And is she right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze searching his, pleading for honesty, for truth. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, naked emotion that took her breath away. He nodded slowly, a single, deliberate movement that confirmed her deepest fears, her most secret hopes. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse, his tone heavy with resignation. "She is right. I have fallen in love with you, Juliana." The words were a confession, a release, a surrender. He had admitted it, to himself, to her, and the world seemed to shift on its axis. She moved towards him, her hands reaching out to him, her fingers touching his face, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheek. He closed his eyes, his body trembling slightly at her touch, a mixture of pleasure and pain. "And I with you, Rhys," she said, her voice choked with emotion, her heart overflowing with a love that was both forbidden and inevitable. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers, and in that moment, everything changed. The barriers, the defenses, the pretenses, all fell away, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their feelings. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he would never let her go. She clung to him, her body pressed against his, her heart beating in time with his. He kissed her then, a kiss that was both desperate and tender, a kiss that spoke of longing, of passion, of a love that had been denied for too long. She returned his kiss, her lips meeting his, her body responding to his touch, her soul merging with his. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated emotion, a moment of surrender, of acceptance, of truth. But it was also a moment of danger. They were breaking the rules, defying the expectations, risking everything for a love that could destroy them both. The reckoning, however sweet, had a bitter edge as they held each other, knowing that the world outside would not make it easy. Chapter 15. Beyond the Walls of Stone. The kiss, the confession, the undeniable truth of their love, changed everything. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing a flood of pent-up emotions, of long-denied desires, of forbidden hopes. They clung to each other, lost in the moment, oblivious to the dangers that surrounded them, to the consequences that awaited them. But reality, like the cold stone walls of Blackwood, could not be ignored forever. They eventually broke apart, their breathing ragged, their hearts pounding, their minds struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had just happened. "This changes nothing, Juliana," Rhys said, his voice hoarse, his gaze searching hers, seeking reassurance, seeking confirmation. "You are still my prisoner, and I am still your captor." She nodded, her gaze meeting his, her heart filled with a mixture of love and fear. "I know, but it changes everything." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek, his touch gentle, tender. "We must be careful, Juliana. More careful than ever. There are those who would use our feelings against us, who would destroy us. She knew he was right. Valerius, Lady Eleanor, the other lords and ladies of Blackwood who suspected their growing attachment, who resented her presence, who feared the influence she might have over Rhys, they would all be watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice low, her tone filled with uncertainty. He took her hand, his grip firm, reassuring. "We continue as before. We maintain the pretense. But we also find a way to be together, a way to forge a future beyond these walls." The words were a promise, a commitment, a declaration of hope. He was not just talking about their love, but about their shared vision for peace, for an end to the feud between their families, for a new beginning. "We need a plan," she said, her mind racing, her thoughts focused on the challenges that lay ahead. "We need allies, people we can trust." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "There are few in my court, in my family, who are not blinded by hatred, who believe in peace. But we must be discreet. We must choose our allies carefully." They spent the rest of the night talking, planning, strategizing. They spoke of their hopes, their fears, their dreams for the future. They shared their secrets, their vulnerabilities, their deepest desires. They forged a bond, a partnership, that was stronger than any political alliance, stronger than any blood tie. As dawn approached, they knew that they had to return to their respective roles, to the pretense of captor and captive. But they also knew that something fundamental had changed, that they were no longer alone, that they had each other. Rhys walked her back to her chambers, their hands clasped tightly, their steps slow, reluctant. They reached her door, and he paused, his gaze searching hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and apprehension. "Be careful, Juliana," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Trust no one completely, except me." She nodded, her gaze meeting his, her heart filled with a love that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "And you, Rhys, be careful." He kissed her then, a brief, fleeting kiss, a promise of what was to come, a seal on their secret alliance. Then, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the corridor, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and dread. She entered her chambers, closing the door behind her, leaning against it, her body trembling. She had crossed a line, taken a leap of faith, and there was no turning back. She was in love with her enemy, and he was in love with her. And together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers threatened them. Their love was a beacon, but now it was a secret, a flame to be guarded as they stepped back into the world, beyond the safety of those walls. Chapter 16. A Dance of Shadows. The following days were a delicate dance, a carefully choreographed performance of deception and hidden truths. Juliana and Rhys maintained their outward roles, captor and captive, their interactions in public marked by the formal courtesy, the subtle distance, that was expected of them. But in private, in the stolen moments they managed to find together, their love blossomed, a fragile flower growing in the shadows of Blackwood. They met in secret, in the library, in the gardens, in her chambers late at night, always careful, always watchful, aware of the ever-present danger of discovery. They shared their thoughts, their fears, their plans for the future, their dreams of a world where Montroses and Thornwicks could live in peace. They began to identify potential allies, those within the Blackwood court who might be sympathetic to their cause, who might be willing to risk their own positions, their own lives, to help them forge a lasting peace. It was a slow, painstaking process, fraught with danger, with the constant threat of betrayal. One evening, during dinner in the Great Hall, Juliana noticed a subtle change in the demeanor of Lady Eleanor. The older woman, usually so sharp, so observant, so critical, seemed distracted, preoccupied. Her gaze drifted towards Juliana, not with the usual suspicion, but with something else. Something that looked like concern. After the meal, as Juliana was walking back to her chambers, accompanied by her silent guard, she encountered Lady Eleanor in the corridor. The older woman stopped her, her expression serious, her gaze intense. "Lady Juliana," she said, her voice low and urgent. "A word with you, if I may." Juliana hesitated, her instincts warning her to be cautious. But something in Eleanor's eyes, a flicker of sincerity, prompted her to agree. "Of course, my lady," she said, her voice neutral, guarded. Eleanor gestured towards a small, empty chamber nearby. "In here, please." Juliana followed her into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, what this sudden change in Eleanor's attitude meant. Was it a trap? A test? Or something else? Eleanor closed the door behind them, her expression grave, her gaze unwavering. "I've been watching you, Lady Juliana," she said, her voice low and intense. "And I have been listening." Juliana remained silent, her gaze fixed on Eleanor's, waiting for her to reveal her intentions. "I know about you and Rhys," Eleanor said, her voice blunt, direct. "I know about your feelings for each other." Juliana's breath caught in her throat. She had been discovered, exposed. But by whom? And what would be the consequences?
"How?"
she began, her voice trembling slightly. Eleanor shook her head. "It does not matter how. What matters is what you intend to do." Juliana looked at her, her confusion growing. "What do you mean?" Eleanor sighed, her expression softening slightly. "I have been wrong about you, Lady Juliana. I believed you were a threat, a danger to Rhys, to Blackwood. I believed you were using him, manipulating him." She paused, her gaze searching Juliana's, as if looking for confirmation, for reassurance. "But I see now that I was mistaken. You love him, and he loves you." The words were unexpected, a complete reversal of Eleanor's previous stance, and Juliana didn't know how to react. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice cautious, wary. Eleanor moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I believe in peace, Lady Juliana. I have seen too much bloodshed, too much hatred, too much loss. And I believe that you and Rhys could be the key to ending this feud, to forging a new future for our families." The words were a revelation, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Eleanor, Rhys's aunt, his advisor, the woman who had seemed to be her most formidable opponent, was offering her support? Her alliance? It was a dance of shadows, and now the steps were changing, a twist in the music that left Juliana reeling, but also hopeful. Chapter 17. The Weight of Loyalty. Lady Eleanor's unexpected offer of support, her willingness to help Juliana and Rhys forge a path to peace, was a turning point. It was a risky alliance, a fragile bond built on shared hopes and mutual desires, but it was also a powerful weapon in their arsenal. Eleanor, with her influence, her knowledge of the Blackwood court, her access to information, became their secret confidant, their advisor, their protector. She guided them, warned them of potential dangers, helped them identify other potential allies, those who might be willing to join their cause. It was a slow, delicate process fraught with risk. They had to be constantly vigilant, constantly on their guard, aware that one wrong step, one misplaced word, could expose their plans, could lead to their destruction. Valerius remained a constant threat, his hostility towards Juliana growing more overt, his suspicions about her relationship with Rhys becoming more acute. He watched them, listened to them, probed them, seeking any weakness, any vulnerability, any opportunity to exploit. One day, during a hunting expedition in the forest surrounding Blackwood, Valerius approached Juliana, his expression sly, his voice dripping with insinuation. "You seem to have captivated my cousin, Lady Juliana," he said, his eyes gleaming with malice. "He is quite taken with you. It is unusual." For Rhys. Juliana met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated by his veiled threats. "Sir Rhys is a courteous host, Lord Valerius," she said, her voice cool, detached. "He treats all his guests with respect." Valerius laughed, a low, throaty sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Guests? Is that what you are, Lady Juliana? A guest? Or something more?" He moved closer, his proximity unsettling, his scent, a cloying mixture of musk and spices, overwhelming. "I know your secret, Lady Juliana," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves, the chirping of the birds. I know about you and Reese, and I will use it. To my advantage. Juliana's heart pounded in her chest, her fear growing. He knew. He had discovered their secret, and he intended to use it against them. I do not know what you are talking about, Lord Valerius, she said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to remain calm. He smiled, a cruel, knowing smile that revealed his sharp teeth. Do not play coy with me, Lady Juliana. I am not a fool. I see the way you look at each other, the way you touch. It is obvious. He reached out and touched her arm, his fingers lingering on her skin, sending a shiver of revulsion through her. But do not worry, Lady Juliana, he said, his voice soft, seductive. Your secret is safe with me for now. Unless you cooperate. Unless you help me. He was offering her a choice, a bargain. Her silence, her cooperation, in exchange for what? Her betrayal of Reese? Her participation in his schemes? I will never betray Sir Reese, she said, her voice firm, her tone defiant, pulling her arm away from his grasp. Valerius's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. Then you have chosen your fate, Lady Juliana, and it will not be pleasant. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the forest, her heart filled with dread, her mind racing. She had made a dangerous enemy, and she knew that he would not rest until he had destroyed her, destroyed Reese, destroyed their love. She returned to the castle, her thoughts in turmoil, her fears growing. She had to warn Reese, to tell him about Valerius's threats, about his knowledge of their secret. But how? And when? She found him in the library, poring over ancient texts, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening slightly as he saw her. Juliana, he said, his voice low, welcoming. What is it? You look troubled. She closed the door behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. Reese, she said, her voice urgent, her tone filled with fear. Valerius, he knows. He knows about us. Reese's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. What? How? She told him everything. All the details that pressed the weight of loyalty and betrayal and the choice before them. Chapter 18. A choice made clear. Reese listened intently as Juliana recounted her encounter with Valerius, his expression growing darker with each word, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists. The news that Valerius knew of their relationship, that he intended to use it against them, was a blow, a serious threat to their plans, to their future. He is a serpent, Juliana, Reese said, his voice low and dangerous, his eyes filled with a cold fury. He has always been jealous, ambitious, and scrupulous. He craves power, and he will stop at nothing to get it. Juliana nodded, her heart filled with dread. He offered me a choice, Reese. My silence, my cooperation in exchange for his protection. He wants me to betray you. Reese reached out and took her hand, his grip firm, reassuring. And you refused him, he said, his voice filled with pride, with admiration. I knew you would. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and fear. But what do we do now, Reese? He knows. He will use it against us. He will expose us. Reese pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he could protect her from the dangers that surrounded them. We fight, Juliana, he said, his voice firm, resolute. We fight him. We fight them all. We fight for our love, for our future, for peace. He kissed her then, a fierce, passionate kiss that spoke of defiance, of determination, of a love that would not be denied. She returned his kiss, her body responding to his touch, her soul merging with his. They broke apart, their breathing ragged, their hearts pounding, their minds focused on the challenges that lay ahead. They had to act quickly, decisively, before Valerius could put his plans into motion, before he could expose them, before he could destroy everything they had worked for. We need to tell Eleanor, Juliana said, her voice urgent, her tone filled with a sense of urgency. She can help us. She knows the court, the players, the dangers. Reese nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Yes. She is our ally. Our confidant. We must trust her. They found Lady Eleanor in her private study, poring over ancient scrolls, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up as they entered, her expression surprised, concerned. Rhys? Juliana? What is it? What has happened? They told her everything, recounting Juliana's encounter with Valerius, his threats, his knowledge of their secret. Eleanor listened intently, her expression growing graver with each word, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear. He is a dangerous man, Rhys, she said, her voice low and urgent. He will stop at nothing to achieve his ambitions. He has always coveted your position, your power. And now he sees an opportunity to seize it. We know, Aunt Rhys said, his voice firm, resolute. But we will not let him. We will fight him. We will expose him. We will defeat him. Eleanor nodded, her gaze thoughtful. We must act quickly, she said, before he can poison the minds of the others. Before he can turn the court against you. They spent the next few hours discussing their options, formulating a plan, strategizing their next moves. It was a risky plan, a dangerous gamble, but it was their only hope. They had to expose Valerius, to reveal his treachery, to undermine his influence, before he could do the same to them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the castle walls, they knew that the time had come to act. They had made their choice, chosen their path, and there was no turning back. Are you ready, Juliana? Rhys asked, his voice low and intense, his gaze searching hers, seeking reassurance, seeking confirmation. She nodded, her gaze meeting his, her heart filled with a love that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Yes, she said, her voice firm, resolute. I am ready. The choice was made, and action was the only path, as they looked at each other, ready to step out into the unknown. Chapter 19. The storm breaks. The great hall of Blackwood was ablaze with light, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat, spices, and wine, the sounds of conversation, laughter, and music filling the vast space. It was the evening feast, and the lords and ladies of Blackwood were gathered, their faces flushed with wine and merriment, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. But beneath the surface of the festivities, a storm was brewing, a tempest of intrigue, betrayal, and love. Juliana and Rhys, their secret exposed, their enemies circling, were about to make their move, to confront Valerius, to expose his treachery, to fight for their future. They entered the hall together, Rhys's arm protectively around Juliana's waist, a gesture that was both defiant and possessive. All eyes turned towards them, the conversations hushed, the music fading, a palpable tension filling the air. Valerius, seated at the high table, his expression sly, his eyes gleaming with malice, watched them approach, a smug smile playing on his lips. He believed he had the upper hand, that he held their fate in his hands, that he was about to triumph. But he was wrong. Rhys led Juliana to the center of the hall, his voice booming across the room, silencing the remaining murmurs. My lords, my ladies, he said, his tone firm, resolute, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests. I have an announcement to make. A revelation. He paused, his gaze locking with Valerius's, his eyes filled with a cold fury. There is a traitor among us, he said, his voice low and dangerous, the words echoing through the hall. A serpent in our midst. A man who has betrayed my trust, betrayed Blackwood, betrayed everything we stand for. All eyes turned towards Valerius, his smug smile vanishing, replaced by a look of shock, of disbelief, of fear. He started to rise, to protest, to deny the accusations, but Rhys cut him off. Lord Valerius, he said, his voice sharp, cutting, his gaze unwavering. You stand accused of treason, of plotting against me, against Blackwood, against peace. Valerius found his voice, his tone filled with outrage, with indignation. This is a lie, he shouted, his face flushed with anger. I am loyal to you, Rhys. To Blackwood. This woman, she is the traitor. She has bewitched you. She has poisoned your mind. He pointed at Juliana, his eyes blazing with hatred, with desperation. But his words fell on deaf ears. Rhys had prepared the ground, had spoken to his key allies, had presented them with evidence of Valerius's treachery, of his secret communications with Thornwick's enemies, of his plans to overthrow Rhys, to seize power for himself. Lady Eleanor stepped forward, her voice calm, authoritative, her gaze fixed on Valerius. "You are a liar, Valerius," she said, her tone filled with contempt. "And a traitor. I have seen the evidence. I have heard the confessions. You're guilty." One by one, the other lords and ladies of Blackwood, those who had been swayed by Rhys and Eleanor, those who believed in peace, those who valued loyalty above ambition, began to speak out, denouncing Valerius, condemning his treachery, affirming their support for Rhys. Valerius was isolated, surrounded by enemies, his carefully constructed web of deceit unraveling before his eyes. He looked around the hall, his gaze desperate, pleading, seeking support, seeking allies, but finding none. He was finished. Rhys stepped forward, his expression grim, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "Guards," he said, his tone commanding. "Seize him." The guards, loyal to Rhys, moved swiftly, surrounding Valerius, seizing him, binding his hands. He struggled, protested, cursed, but it was futile. His reign of terror, his dreams of power, were over. The storm had broken, the tempest had raged, and now the calm had returned. But it was a fragile calm, a tentative peace, a victory that had been hard-won, a future that was still uncertain. Rhys turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with love, with gratitude, with hope. He took her hand, his grip firm, reassuring. "It is done," he said, his voice low and tender. "We are free." The storm cleared, and the dust settled with an uneasy silence. But the next challenge was clear: what to do now. Chapter 20. Dawn of a New Allegiance. With Valerius imprisoned, his treachery exposed, his influence shattered, a new sense of hope, of possibility, filled the halls of Blackwood. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the larger challenge remained: forging a lasting peace between Blackwood and Thornwick, ending the centuries-old feud that had claimed so many lives, had caused so much suffering. Rhys, with Juliana by his side, and with the support of Lady Eleanor and a growing number of allies within the Blackwood court, began the difficult, delicate process of negotiation. He sent emissaries to Thornwick, bearing messages of peace, of reconciliation, of a willingness to compromise. It was not easy. The years of hatred, of mistrust, of bloodshed, could not be erased overnight. There were those on both sides who opposed peace, who clung to the old ways, who believed that the only solution was conquest. But there were also those who were weary of war, who longed for a better future, who were willing to take a chance on peace. Juliana's brother, Edward, the young lord of Thornwick, was one of them. He had received Rhys's messages with a mixture of skepticism and hope. He knew that his sister was being held captive in Blackwood, but he also knew that she was different. She had always been strong-willed, independent, compassionate. He trusted her judgment, her instincts, and he believed that she would not betray her family, her people. He agreed to meet with Rhys, to discuss the possibility of peace, to negotiate the terms of a truce. The meeting was to take place at a neutral location, a small, abandoned monastery on the border between Blackwood and Thornwick, a place that had once been a sanctuary, a refuge from the violence of the world. Juliana and Rhys, accompanied by Lady Eleanor and a small escort of guards, rode to the monastery, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They were taking a risk, a gamble, but it was a risk they were willing to take. They arrived at the monastery to find Edward waiting for them, accompanied by his own advisors, his own guards. The two groups faced each other, their expressions wary, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken mistrust, with the weight of history, of generations of conflict. But then, Juliana stepped forward, her gaze meeting her brother's, her voice clear and steady. "Edward," she said, her tone filled with a mixture of love and pleading. "We have a chance to end this. a chance to forge a new future. Edward looked at her, his expression softening slightly. He saw in her eyes, not the captive, not the enemy, but his sister, the woman he had grown up with, the woman he trusted. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, a sign of agreement. "I am willing to listen," he said, his voice low, cautious. Rhys stepped forward, his gaze meeting Edward's, his expression earnest, sincere. "I offer you peace, Lord Edward," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "Not as a conqueror, but as an equal. I offer you an alliance, a partnership, a future together." The negotiations began, a long, arduous process, filled with arguments, disagreements, compromises. But slowly, gradually, progress was made. The two sides, guided by Juliana and Rhys, by their shared vision for peace, by their love, began to find common ground, to bridge the gap that had separated them for so long. Finally, after days of intense negotiation, an agreement was reached. A truce was declared, a pact of non-aggression, a commitment to peace. The border between Blackwood and Thornwick would be redrawn, the disputed land divided equally, the rights of the people on both sides protected. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a beginning, a start, a step towards a better future. Juliana and Rhys, their hands clasped tightly, their hearts filled with hope, watched as their respective families, their people, began to mingle, to talk, to understand. The dawn of a new allegiance had arrived, a new era had begun. And it was all thanks to the love, the courage, the faith of a captive and a knight, a woman and a man who had dared to dream of peace. The agreement was made, sealed. But the epilogue would show what that meant in reality. Epilogue. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The wounds of the past, the scars of centuries of conflict, did not heal overnight. There were still those who clung to the old hatreds, who resisted the new alliance, who plotted in the shadows, seeking to undermine the fragile peace. But the tide had turned. The seeds of hope, of understanding, of love, had been planted, and they had taken root. Blackwood and Thornwick, once bitter enemies, were now allies, partners, friends. Juliana and Rhys, their love a beacon of hope, a symbol of reconciliation, ruled together, not as conqueror and captive, but as husband and wife, as equals, as partners in a shared vision for a better future. They had married, a grand ceremony held at the very monastery where the peace treaty had been signed, a union that was both political and personal. Their marriage solidified the alliance, cemented the bond between their families, their people. It was a testament to the power of love, the power of forgiveness, the power of hope. They worked tirelessly to build a lasting peace, to heal the wounds of the past, to create a society where Montroses and Thornwicks could live together in harmony, in mutual respect, in love. They established joint councils, fostered trade, encouraged cultural exchange, promoted understanding and tolerance. They had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up in a world where the feud between Blackwood and Thornwick was a distant memory, a tale told by grandparents, a legend from a bygone era. Their children, the embodiment of the new alliance, represented the future, a future free from hatred, free from violence, free from fear. Lady Eleanor, once skeptical, once wary of Juliana, became their staunchest supporter, their wisest advisor, their friend. She saw in their union, in their love, the fulfillment of her own long-held dream, the dream of a peaceful, prosperous future for Blackwood, for Thornwick, for everyone. Valerius, his plots foiled, his ambitions thwarted, remained imprisoned, a bitter, forgotten man, a reminder of the darkness that had once threatened to consume them all. His name became a curse, a warning, a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition. As the years passed, Juliana and Rhys grew old together, their love deepening, their bond strengthening, their legacy secured. They had faced countless challenges, overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and they had triumphed. They had proven that love could conquer hate, that peace could overcome war, that hope could triumph over despair. They had shown the world that even the most bitter enemies could become allies, that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the darkest nights could give way to the dawn. They ruled justly, fairly, and with compassion. And so, the story of the captive and the knight, the woman and the man who had dared to dream of peace, became a legend, a tale told and retold, a testament to the enduring power of love, the enduring power of hope. A tale whispered through the ages, an enduring example of the greatest, most difficult truth, that even enemies can choose love. The end.